My younger sister framed me in court, and as the bailiff called for order, the heavy, humid air of that Georgia courtroom felt like a physical weight against my chest. My name is Sloan, and 7 years ago, I was cast out of this city like a common criminal. But today, I returned to reclaim a legacy that was built on my sweat and blood. Caitlin Miller sat across from me, her designer black lace veil barely concealing the predatory, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She didn't look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a woman who had finally cleared the last obstacle between her and our mother's millions. Her expensive attorney leaned in, whispering loud enough for the entire front row to hear that I was unstable and financially desperate, a narrative my parents had spent nearly a decade crafting to justify my exile. "She's lying," my dad barked from the gallery, his face a mask of practiced cold disappointment as he gripped the arm of my mother's empty chair. My parents sat behind her, their unified, stony silence serving as the ultimate betrayal, as if my very existence was a stain on the family name. I could feel my face burning under the weight of their collective judgment, and for a fleeting moment, the room felt like it was closing in on me. But then, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a controlled, terrifying authority. A man walked in, his presence commanding every ounce of oxygen out of the room, and as his cold eyes locked onto Caitlin and Barrett, the blood visibly drained from their faces. They turned pale, and for the first time in 7 years, the predator realized she had become the prey. Before the truth destroys this family legacy forever, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this reckoning. Trust me, you don't want to miss the twist that's coming next. The humid savanna air felt like a physical weight against my skin as I pulled into the gravel driveway of my family's estate 7 years ago, oblivious to the fact that my life was about to be dismantled. I had just returned from a grueling 3-week business trip to London, securing the international distribution rights that our family's textile empire desperately needed to survive the recession. My father, Arthur, had promised me that this deal would solidify my position as the future CEO, a title I had earned through a decade of 80-hour work weeks and sacrificed relationships. As I pushed open the heavy oak front doors, the house was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I headed toward the library, expecting to find my parents reviewing the contracts, but instead, the muffled sound of laughter drifted from the upstairs master suite, a high, melodic giggle that I recognized instantly as my younger sister, Caitlin Miller. My heart hammered against my ribs as I climbed the stairs, a cold sense of dread washing over me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I reached the doorway of the bedroom I was supposed to share with my fiancé, Barrett Miller, and froze. The sight inside was a jagged blade to my soul. Barrett, the man who had asked for my hand in marriage only 6 months prior, was tangled in the silk sheets with Caitlin. They weren't just caught in an affair, they were celebrating. A bottle of vintage Bollinger sat on the nightstand, and my younger sister was wearing the heirloom pearl necklace my mother had promised to give me on my wedding day. "It's better this way, babe," I heard Barrett whisper, his voice lacking even a shred of remorse. "Sloan is too obsessed with the business. She's cold. You're the one who actually knows how to enjoy the life we're building." I didn't scream. I didn't throw a fit. I simply stepped into the room and cleared my throat, the sound sharp enough to make them both bolt upright. Caitlin didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She simply tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear and looked at me with a triumphant, feline grin. "Oh, Sloan, you're home early," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl, as if she were the rightful lady of the house and I was merely an uninvited guest. Before I could utter a single word of rage, the heavy footsteps of my father thundered down the hallway. Arthur and my mother, Eleanor, appeared behind me, but they didn't look at the bed with horror. They looked at me with a cold, calculated indifference that hurt worse than the infidelity. "Enough with the theatrics, Sloan," my father barked, stepping into the room to hand Barrett a fresh robe. I stood there, trembling, waiting for him to demand an explanation for this betrayal, but the explanation had already been decided in my absence. My mother stepped forward, her hands folded primly over her cashmere sweater. "Barrett has informed us that the London deal was actually his lead, and that you've been mismanaging the accounts to hide your own failures," she said, her voice as flat as a New England winter. "My younger sister has shown us the proof. She's the one who truly cares about this family's reputation, not someone who puts a balance sheet over her own sister's happiness." I realized then that this wasn't just an affair, it was a coup. They had stripped me of my career, my fiancé, and my dignity in one coordinated strike. My father pointed toward the door, his eyes devoid of any paternal warmth. Pack a single suitcase and leave, Sloan. You're no longer a part of this firm, or this family. We've already filed the paperwork to remove your name from the trust. I walked out into the rain that night with nothing but a carry-on bag and a burning vow that I would never, ever let them see me break. My younger sister, Caitlin Miller, didn't just take my fiancé. She spent the next 7 years systematically dismantling every legacy our family had built over 3 generations. While I was struggling to find my footing in the cold, indifferent streets of New York City, Caitlin was busy transforming our family's historic textile firm into her personal ATM. She rebranded herself as the Queen of Savannah Style, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on lavish gala sponsorships and hollow social media influence, while the actual manufacturing plants began to rot from the inside out. I watched from a distance, monitoring the public filings as the company's once pristine credit rating began to slip. Barrett Miller, the man who had supposedly been the strategic genius to save our firm, proved to be nothing more than a silver-tongued opportunist with a penchant for high-risk, low-reward real estate gambles. The internal rot became undeniable about 3 years ago when Barrett leveraged our family's main estate to fund a luxury condominium project in Florida that never broke ground. According to the private reports I received from Mr. Whitaker, the longtime butler who remained my only loyal eyes and ears in that house, the atmosphere in the Miller household had turned toxic. Caitlin and Barrett's perfect marriage was a performance staged entirely for the local society columns, while behind closed doors, they were drowning in a sea of litigation and mounting debt. My father, Arthur, had become a shadow of his former self, blinded by his refusal to admit he had picked the wrong daughter to lead his legacy. He allowed Caitlin to liquidate my mother's private jewelry collection pieces that had been in our family for over a century, just to cover the interest payments on Barrett's failing construction loans. By the time my mother, Eleanor, fell terminally ill 6 months ago, the situation had reached a breaking point. Caitlin didn't see our mother's declining health as a tragedy. She saw it as an opportunity for one final, desperate payday. With the textile firm facing a $2 million shortfall and Barrett's creditors circling like sharks in the Savannah River, they needed Eleanor's personal trust to stay afloat. They cut off her access to outside visitors, fired her longtime nurses, and replaced them with staff who were paid to look the other way. They isolated her in the east wing of the mansion, whispering lies into her ear about how I had forgotten her, how I had never called, and how I was waiting for her to pass just so I could sue for her money. The cruelty of their plan was breathtaking in its simplicity. They weren't just waiting for her to die. They were actively accelerating the process by denying her the specialized care she needed, all while keeping her sedated enough to sign whatever updates to her will they placed in front of her. Caitlin spent those final months playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken daughter to the public, posting tearful updates on her Instagram feed while she was actually raiding the silver vaults and moving antique furniture into off-site storage. They believed they had successfully buried the truth alongside my mother, never realizing that every predatory move they made was being logged, time-stamped, and sent directly to my office in Manhattan. They thought I was a ghost, a defeated memory of a sister they had outsmarted, but I was simply the storm they never saw coming. The first winter in New York City nearly broke me, but it also forged the steel in my spine that Savannah had spent years trying to soften. I arrived at Port Authority with exactly $400 in my pocket and a single suitcase filled with bitter memories. My younger sister, Caitlin Miller, probably imagined me starving in a cold walk-up apartment, but she underestimated the decade of expertise I had built in the textile and estate world. I didn't crawl back to Georgia begging for a second chance. Instead, I took a job as a junior clerk at a prestigious Manhattan art and estate appraisal firm. I worked 16-hour days, spending my nights studying international tax laws and corporate debt structures, fueled by a cold, quiet fury. Within 3 years, I had become the youngest senior appraiser in the firm's history, specializing in the liquidation of distressed family empires, a skill set I knew would eventually be the undoing of my own. It was during a high-stakes auction for a prominent Newport estate 5 years ago that I first met Reese Sterling. He wasn't just another wealthy bidder. He was the founding partner of Sterling and Associates, a private equity firm known for buying up the debt of failing legacy companies and rebuilding them from the ground up. Reese was the man people called when they wanted to dismantle a corrupt dynasty piece by piece. When he approached me after the auction to discuss the valuation of a rare Georgian emerald collection, he didn't see a disgraced runaway from the South. He saw an intellectual equal. Our partnership began with a shared respect for precision and truth, but it evolved into a marriage built on a foundation of absolute loyalty, something I had never experienced with Barrett Miller or my own parents. Reese knew every detail of my exile from Savannah, and instead of offering pity, he offered me the resources to execute a flawless counterstrike. He watched as I spent my weekends analyzing the dwindling financial reports of the Miller family firm, identifying every fraudulent move Barrett made to keep his failing real estate projects afloat. When Reese and I married 4 years ago in a private ceremony at the New York Supreme Court, I didn't send an invitation to Georgia. I didn't need their approval. I had already built a new family, one that valued competence over bloodlines. We spent our evenings in our Tribeca loft, not discussing interior design, but mapping out the legal and financial web that would eventually trap Caitlin and her opportunistic husband. By the time the news of my mother's illness reached us, Reese and I were ready. We didn't just have a plan, we had an arsenal. Reese had quietly instructed his firm to start acquiring the high-interest debt that Barrett Miller had been recklessly accumulating through secondary lenders. We weren't just monitoring their downfall. We were becoming the owners of it. Every time my younger sister posted a new photo of her lavish lifestyle on social media, I saw another piece of my mother's stolen legacy being sold off to fund a lie. But I remained silent, waiting for the one moment where their legal vulnerability would be at its peak. I wasn't just going back for my inheritance. I was going back to show my father, Arthur, exactly what happens when you trade a loyal daughter for a silver-tongued thief. The encrypted file arrived in my inbox at 3 a.m, sent from a burner account I knew belonged to Mr. Whitaker, the only man in Savannah who still remembered what loyalty looked like. For 30 years, he had served as our family's butler, a silent observer of our rise and eventual moral decay. While my younger sister, Caitlin Miller, was busy hosting charity brunches to distract the local elite from her husband's mounting lawsuits, Mr. Whitaker was documenting the slow, agonizing isolation of my mother, Eleanor. The file contained time-stamped photos of a side of the estate the public never saw, the East Wing, where the once vibrant gardens had been replaced by overgrown weeds and the windows were permanently shuttered. My heart constricted as I scrolled through images of my mother, looking frail and hollowed out, surrounded by medical equipment that hadn't been serviced in months. The most damning evidence, however, was a series of audio recordings captured by a hidden device Mr. Whitaker had placed in the master suite. In them, I could hear Caitlin's voice, stripped of its southern charm and replaced by a cold, jagged edge. She wasn't comforting our dying mother, she was berating her. "Just sign the amendment, Eleanor," Caitlin hissed in one recording, the sound of a pen scratching against paper filling the silence. "Sloan hasn't called in 7 years. She's probably waiting for you to die in some dirty New York alleyway. I'm the only one who stayed. I'm the only one who deserves this house." My mother's voice was barely a whisper, a broken plea for a phone call she was never allowed to receive, but my younger sister simply laughed. It was a calculated, psychological assault designed to break a dying woman's will until she believed the lies she was being fed. According to Mr. Whitaker's detailed logs, Barrett Miller had brought in a disreputable notary from out of town, someone whose career was as stained as his own, to oversee the signing of a new will just 48 hours before Eleanor passed away. This document supposedly revoked my original inheritance and granted Caitlin full control over the family's private trust, including the mineral rights and the Savannah estate. They were desperate. The $2 million debt Barrett owed to his primary lenders was coming due, and they needed my mother's liquid assets to prevent a public foreclosure. They thought they were being clever by isolating her, firing the legitimate hospice nurses and replacing them with hired hands who were paid to keep her sedated and silent. What they didn't realize was that every medication log, every forced signature, and every moment of neglect was being meticulously cataloged by a man they treated like furniture. Mr. Whitaker had seen Barrett and Caitlin celebrating in the library with a bottle of champagne the night the amendment was signed, toasted to a victory they hadn't yet won. As I sat in my office in Manhattan, Reese Sterling standing behind me with a hand on my shoulder, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The grief for my mother was there, but it was overshadowed by a cold, surgical need for justice. My younger sister believed she had poisoned my mother's mind against me, but she had actually provided me with the ultimate weapon. We weren't just going to contest the will, we were going to turn their supposed triumph into a criminal indictment. The strategy for our return to Georgia wasn't built on emotion. It was built on a foundation of cold, hard capital. Reese Sterling spent the 3 weeks following Eleanor's funeral in a windowless boardroom in Lower Manhattan, working with his team of forensic accountants to trace the jagged trail of debt Barrett Miller had left across the Southeast. We didn't just want to contest a will. We wanted to own the very roof over my younger sister's head. While Caitlin Miller was busy picking out custom marble for a kitchen renovation she couldn't afford, Reese was quietly buying up the distressed promissory notes that Barrett had used to collateralize our family's textile mill. By the time we were finished, Sterling and Associates held over $4 million of Barrett's personal and corporate debt, making us the primary lien holder on every asset he possessed. I spent my days at the appraisal firm, meticulously cross-referencing the inventory lists provided by Mr. Whitaker against the public auction records in Savannah. It was a painstaking process, but it revealed a pattern of systematic theft that went far beyond the will. Caitlin had been selling off rare family heirlooms first edition books, antique silver services, and French Impressionist sketches to private collectors to fund her social lifestyle. She believed these private sales would go unnoticed, but she forgot that the world of high-end appraisals is a very small circle. I tracked down 3 specific collectors who had purchased items from her, each one providing a signed affidavit that my younger sister had represented herself as the sole owner of the estate while our mother was still breathing on her deathbed. The legal pressure was mounting, but we needed the timing to be surgical. Reese coordinated with a high-profile law firm in Savannah, the kind of firm my father, Arthur, had always respected and feared. We didn't inform them of my identity initially. We simply presented them with the evidence of financial coercion and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the new will. When they saw the medical logs showing my mother had been under heavy sedation during the hour the notary supposedly witnessed her signature, their lead partner agreed to take the case on a contingency basis. They saw the same thing I did. A clear-cut case of elder abuse and fraud that would strip Caitlin of every legal standing she thought she had. On the night before we boarded the private jet for Savannah, Reese sat me down in our library and handed me a thick, leather-bound folder. Inside was the final piece of the puzzle, a foreclosure notice for the Miller estate, triggered by the very debt Reese now controlled. My younger sister and her husband were living in a house of cards, and we were about to pull the bottom card. There was no hesitation in my heart, no lingering desire for a tearful reconciliation with my father or a sisterly embrace. They had traded my loyalty for a lie 7 years ago, and now they were going to learn the true cost of that transaction. We weren't just going back to Savannah to attend a hearing. We were going back to preside over the total collapse of their stolen empire. The ancient oaks of Bonaventure Cemetery cast long, twisted shadows over my mother's final resting place, a stark contrast to the blinding white lilies my younger sister, Caitlin Miller, had ordered for the ceremony. After the graveside service ended, the air remained thick with the scent of humid earth and unspoken hostility. Caitlin didn't wait for the mourners to disperse before she approached me, her black lace veil pushed back to reveal a face devoid of grief and brimming with a predatory satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come, Sloan," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of the remaining Savannah elite. "You're a ghost in this town." Mother knew it, and Father knows it. That's why she left everything, the house, the company, the trust, to the only daughter who didn't abandon her for a cold life in the North. My father, Arthur, stood like a stone sentinel behind her, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket of disapproval that I had felt for 7 long years. Barrett Miller stood to his right, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit with a nervous energy that belied the triumphant smirk on his lips. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, the same look he had given me the night he chose Caitlin's greed over our engagement. "It's over, Sloan," Barrett added, his voice oily with false concern. "We have the amended will, notarized and filed. You're facing a mountain of legal fees if you try to contest this, and frankly, we all know you don't have the capital to fight us." They believed they had cornered me in the very place where our mother's memory was supposed to be honored, using her death as the ultimate leverage to finally erase me from the family ledger. I didn't blink. I didn't let the heat rising in my cheeks betray the storm I had brought with me from Manhattan. I simply looked at my younger sister and the man she had stolen, watching as they preened in their supposed victory. "You talk about capital, Barrett," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with a surgical precision that made him flinch. But you've spent 7 years trading on a name that no longer has any value. You've leveraged this estate to the breaking point to fund a lifestyle built on sand. Caitlin laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the nearby headstones. And what are you going to do about it? You're a hired appraiser, Sloan. You count other people's money. You don't have the power to touch us. That was the moment the heavy crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a sleek, black sedan that pulled up to the edge of the family plot. The door opened, and Reese Sterling stepped out, his presence immediately shifting the gravitational pull of the entire gathering. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who already owned the ground he was standing on. As he came to my side and placed a protective hand on the small of my back, I saw the recognition flash in Barrett's eyes, a sudden, paralyzing realization of who Reese was. "Mr. Miller," Reese said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the whispering crowd. "I believe you're mistaken about who holds the capital in this family. My firm, Sterling and Associates, recently acquired the entirety of your primary construction debt and the secondary liens on this estate. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I am your primary creditor, and I am here to discuss the immediate acceleration of those payments." The color drained from Caitlin's face, her triumphant smirk dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she realized the man I had married was the very man who held the keys to her survival. The silence that followed Reese Sterling's declaration was so heavy it felt as though the very air in Savannah had frozen. My younger sister, Caitlin Miller, stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly agape as she looked from Reese to the foreclosure notice he held with practiced indifference. But the financial ruin was only the first wave of the storm I had brought home. Before Barrett Miller could stammer out a defense, the sound of slow, rhythmic footsteps on the gravel path drew everyone's attention. Mr. Whitaker approached, dressed in his formal black livery, carrying a digital tablet as if it were a silver serving tray. He didn't look at my father, or the sister who had treated him like an invisible fixture for 30 years. He walked straight to the lead detective of the Savannah Police Department, who had been waiting discreetly near the cemetery gate. "Detective, I believe this is the evidence you requested regarding the welfare of Mrs. Eleanor Miller," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice steady and devoid of the subservient tone he had used for decades. He activated the screen, and a grainy but clear video began to play a hidden camera feed from the east wing of our estate. The crowd of onlookers gasped as they saw Caitlin hovering over our mother's bed, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. The audio was unmistakable. My younger sister was screaming at a dying woman, shaking her frail shoulders, and demanding she sign the final probate documents, while our mother drifted in a drug-induced stupor. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a recorded felony of elder abuse and forced coercion. Barrett tried to lunge toward the tablet, his face flushed a deep, panicked crimson, but Reese stepped in his path with a calm, immovable strength. "I wouldn't do that, Barrett," Reese warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Every byte of that data is already mirrored on a secure server in Manhattan. You're not just losing the house, you're losing your freedom." My father, Arthur, looked as though he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. He stared at the screen, at the daughter he had championed, and then at the evidence of the monster she had become under his protection. He reached out a trembling hand toward me, but I stepped back, my heart a block of ice that no late-onset regret could melt. The clink of metal handcuffs was the final punctuation mark on Caitlin's social reign. The detective moved in, spinning my younger sister around and pinning her arms behind her back as he read her the Miranda rights in front of the very people she had spent years trying to impress. Caitlin's scream was a high, shrill sound of pure desperation, a far cry from the melodic giggle I had heard in my bedroom 7 years ago. As she was led toward the police cruiser, Barrett was served with a separate warrant for massive financial fraud and the embezzlement of company pension funds, a paper trail Reese had meticulously reconstructed. They had thought they were burying me and my mother's legacy in this cemetery, but as the sun began to set over the moss-draped oaks, it was their own lives that were being laid to rest. The following morning, the sun rose over Savannah with a clarity that felt almost clinical, illuminating the hollow shell of a dynasty that had finally collapsed under its own weight. My younger sister, Caitlin Miller, was being held without bail at the Chatham County Jail, facing a litany of felony charges including elder exploitation, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit forgery. Barrett Miller, stripped of his bravado and his designer suits, was being processed by federal authorities for a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme he had hidden within the walls of our family's textile firm. There would be no high-priced lawyers to save them this time. Reese Sterling had ensured that every liquid asset they possessed was frozen, and every line of credit was severed. They had spent 7 years stealing a life they didn't earn, and now they would spend the next 2 decades paying for it in a federal penitentiary. I stood in the grand foyer of the estate one last time, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock sounding like a countdown to my own liberation. My father, Arthur, sat in the library, a broken man surrounded by the ghosts of a legacy he had traded for a lie. He looked up as I approached, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading, searching for a shred of the loyal daughter he had discarded 7 years ago. "Sloan, I was blinded." "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperation that would have broken me once. "Please, we can fix this. We can rebuild the firm together. You're a Sterling now. You have the resources." I held up a hand, silencing the man who had only recognized my value once I became the person who held his fate in my hands. "There is nothing to fix, Arthur," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the Atlantic tide. "You didn't just lose a company. You lost the only person who would have protected you for free. You chose the daughter who flattered you over the daughter who worked for you, and now you have to live with the consequences of that choice." I handed him a single, legal envelope, not an offer of reconciliation, but a notice of eviction. As the primary lien holder, Reese and I had made the decision to donate the entire estate to a local foundation for elder protection. The house would be turned into a sanctuary for those who, like my mother, had been silenced by the greed of their own kin. I watched as the realization hit him that I wasn't there to save him, but to ensure that the cycle of betrayal ended with me. Reese was waiting for me at the end of the driveway, the engine of the car humming a soft, rhythmic promise of a future that didn't involve the weight of Savannah's secrets. I didn't look back as we drove toward the airport, leaving the crumbling Miller name in the rearview mirror. The lesson I learned wasn't about the power of money or the satisfaction of revenge. It was about the absolute necessity of self-worth. People will only treat you with the respect you demand for yourself, and blood doesn't give anyone a license to destroy your soul. I had lost a family of shadows, but I had gained a life of substance. As we boarded the jet back to New York, I realized that the greatest inheritance my mother had ever left me wasn't the money or the house. It was the strength to walk away and never, ever look back.